Margaret Whitmore had once commanded auditoriums filled with restless students, teachers awaiting guidance, and parents seeking wisdom. At 74, she had been a beloved high school principal, known for her firm compassion and unwavering standards. Now, she spent her days folding laundry that wasn't hers, stirring soup that went unthanked, and quietly picking up crayons scattered by her toddler grandson, Lucas. Before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't yet. It had been a small, forlorn misstep on the porch stairs, but enough to sprain her ankle and worry her daughter. Angela had offered, insisted even, that Margaret come stay with her and Derek just until you're back on your feet. They set up the guest room, made space in the fridge, and told her she was welcome for as long as needed. At first, Margaret believed them. She woke early to make breakfast, chopping fruit into star shapes the way Angela used to love as a child. She tidied the kitchen before anyone noticed the mess, folded Lucas's onesies into perfect rows, and baked banana bread with extra walnuts just the way Derek preferred. She tried, without asking, to make herself useful, to feel needed, to not be a burden. But usefulness didn't equal presence. No one said thank you. No one asked her to sit and rest or join their conversations. If anything, she'd become part of the furniture, something there, but silent and secondary. Her voice was barely a ripple in the household flow. It wasn't until Angela's birthday party that Margaret truly saw the shape of her invisibility. Their home had filled with laughter that evening, coworkers, friends, neighbors, a light jazz playlist humming under the clink of wine glasses. Margaret had helped prepare the appetizers, arranged flowers, even watched Lucas for 2 hours while Angela got her hair done. She wore her best cardigan, applied a soft touch of lipstick, and waited for Angela to introduce her to the guests she didn't recognize. Angela did. "This is my mom," she said, her smile tight. "She's staying with us for a little while until she can walk properly again." Margaret's hand tightened around the glass of sparkling cider. Then Derek chuckled and added, "One extra mouth to feed, but hey, she folds a mean-fitted sheet." The group laughed. Margaret smiled. She had perfected that smile years ago, quiet, pleasant, polite. But inside, something wilted. They moved on to another conversation. No one noticed that Margaret stepped away, slipping out to the backyard, where the fairy lights glowed faintly in the dusk. She sat down on the edge of the patio, the sound of laughter drifting through the windows like a language she no longer understood. She wasn't angry, not in the way some might expect. It wasn't rage that settled in her chest, it was something quieter, colder, a dawning realization. She had stopped being someone. She had become something, an obligation with a pulse, a piece of background noise. She sipped her drink slowly, watching the light dance across the surface. Once, she had led a faculty of 60. Once, parents had waited in line to hear her advice. Once, her voice could still silence a room. Now, her own daughter introduced her like a temporary inconvenience, and her son-in-law had reduced her presence to a punchline. Margaret sat still for a long while after the party moved indoors, long enough to feel the night air settle on her shoulders. She wasn't crying. The hurt was too old for tears, it had just been waiting for a moment to be named. And now it had one. The house was unusually quiet that afternoon, the kind of hush that falls when everyone's gone out, and even the clock seems to tick slower, louder. Margaret stood in the kitchen, folding dish towels the way she'd done her entire adult life, neatly, symmetrically, without fuss. A pot of soup simmered gently on the stove behind her, the comforting scent of carrots, celery, and bay leaf floating through the air. She didn't mean to eavesdrop. It was just that the back door had creaked open, and Angela's voice floated in from the patio where she stood talking on the phone. Margaret recognized the tone instantly, the slight pitch in her voice, the way it dropped at the end of each sentence. It was the same voice Angela used with credit card companies, with her boss, with real estate agents. Polite, measured, impatient. "No, we haven't found a way to move her yet," Angela was saying. "Honestly, if she wasn't helping with groceries, I doubt we could justify keeping her here." The sentence hit like a pane of glass cracking, no sound, just the slow fracture of something once solid. Margaret froze. Her hands stopped mid-fold. Her fingers gripped the edges of the towel as if anchoring herself to something real. The soup burbled softly behind her, utterly unaware. "She gives us a little from her pension," Angela continued. "But that barely covers what she eats, let alone the utilities. I mean, it's not like she's paying rent. Derek's been really patient about it, but we can't support 3 people on 1 income. And you know I only work part-time." There was a pause, and Margaret could hear her daughter sigh. "I'm just saying, it would be easier if she wasn't here. That's all. That's all." Margaret turned away from the window slowly, the towel still clutched in her hands. Her knees didn't give out, but they trembled in that almost invisible way that only someone her age would notice. She made her way back to the sink, washed her hands, and turned off the stove. The soup was done, but the warmth it promised felt irrelevant now. It wasn't the money. She had never minded contributing. In fact, it made her feel useful again, like she had a purpose beyond watching television and being asked to babysit at the last minute. But now she understood. Her help had never been seen as love. It had been interpreted as payment, a transaction. Every grocery bill she quietly paid, every box of diapers she slipped into the Target cart, every pair of new shoes for her grandson and of it, had been received with the spirit of generosity she'd intended. It was rent, a price tag for space in her daughter's home, and maybe in her life. She stood there, motionless, for a long time. Not angry, just hollow. How had something as sacred as family become so conditional? When did the bond between mother and daughter get reduced to utility bills and food expenses? It was as though years of bedtime stories, piano recitals, scraped knees and whispered encouragement had evaporated into this cold, calculated reality. It wasn't cruelty that hurt her, most it was the indifference. Angela had not yelled. She had not accused her of anything. She had merely stated facts, in that practiced voice of adult responsibility, forgetting entirely that the woman whose worth she calculated by groceries and gas bills had once carried her through sleepless nights, held her as she sobbed over failed exams and first heartbreaks, stood proud in the front row of every achievement. And now, apparently, she stayed only because she could still pay her way. Margaret felt something shift inside her, not a collapse, but a slow and irreversible tilt, like a picture frame quietly falling askew on the wall. She didn't cry. She didn't storm outside or demand explanations. She simply took a deep breath and reached for the teacup on the counter, the one with the tiny chip on the rim she always turned toward herself. She sat down, alone, and took a sip. The tea was still warm, but everything else was suddenly, heartbreakingly cold. Margaret didn't confront Angela. She didn't raise her voice or slam any doors. That had never been her way, not as a mother, not as an educator, and certainly not now, in the winter of her life. What she felt was beyond fury. It was a deeper, achier, silent fracture that didn't scream, only quietly reshaped her understanding of what home had become. She began her retreat gently, almost invisibly. In the early mornings, before the household stirred, she would leave a note on the counter. Out for a walk and take the short stroll to a cafe just 2 blocks away. It was nothing fancy, just a corner spot with chipped mugs and a radio that played soft jazz, but it gave her something she hadn't felt in months: space. Space to breathe, to be addressed by her name, not her function. Here, the barista greeted her as Ms. Margaret with a smile that reached his eyes, and the regulars began saving her the window seat without being asked. With a warm cup between her hands and the hum of life around her, Margaret slowly began reclaiming herself. She started journaling again, nothing elaborate, just quiet reflections written in her elegant, looping script. "I am still here," she wrote once, "even if they can't see me." Back at the house, she quietly gathered documents, insurance papers, pension statements, old letters from Harold. She made a call to her attorney and scheduled a meeting to revise her will. It wasn't out of spite, it was clarity. She'd spent her life giving her energy, her wisdom, her patience. And now, she would decide where the last chapters of her story would unfold and who would be part of them. One morning at the cafe, just as she was finishing her coffee, a voice called her, Nama voice she hadn't heard in decades. "Mrs. Langston?" Margaret turned, blinking in surprise. A tall woman with confident posture and kind eyes stood before her. It was Jasmine, one of her former students now in her 40s, dressed in a tailored blazer with a real estate badge pinned neatly to the lapel. They talked for over an hour. Jasmine had gone on to manage a respected property agency in town. She spoke with admiration, recalling how Margaret once stayed late after class to tutor her in math, and how that small act of belief had changed her trajectory. "You always made people feel seen," Jasmine said, touching her hand lightly. "Let me return the favor. If you ever need help finding a place your own space, somewhere that's yours again, call me." For the first time in a long while, Margaret felt not like a burden, but like someone remembered. She smiled, a quiet promise forming behind her calm expression. She didn't need to fight to be seen. She just needed to walk in the direction of her own life again. Margaret moved out without a word. No confrontation, no farewell dinner, no dramatic exchange in the hallway. Just a quiet note on the kitchen table that read, "Thank you for the roof. I've found my own now." She packed her things in silence, one cardigan, one framed photo, one book of poetry at a time, items that had long ceased to feel at home in a house where she'd become invisible. The apartment she chose was Modesta, one bedroom in an aging building tucked behind a row of cafes and laundromats. The floors creaked, and the wallpaper had long lost its charm, but the windows let in light, and the silence belonged only to her. That alone made it feel like freedom. It was a temporary rental at first. The building was in financial distress, on the verge of foreclosure. But as fate would have it, the building manager, now a real estate consultant, was a familiar face. Allison, a former student from Margaret's years as a principal. The moment they recognized one another, something shifted in Allison's posture, not out of pity, but respect. "You were the first person who ever told me I was capable of more," Allison said, pouring tea in Margaret's still bare kitchen. "Let me help you build something of your own now." With Allison's guidance and Margaret's years of careful savings, they negotiated a deal that gave Margaret ownership of the building outright. Not as a landlord chasing profit, but as a custodian with purpose. She renamed it the Well Housenot, after a place of wealth, but a place of restoration, of drawing strength from within. Margaret renovated the units one by one, and quietly began offering affordable housing to women like herself, retired, overlooked, sometimes displaced, always resilient. There were no grand announcements, just a small plaque by the entrance. "For the women who have poured into others all their lives and now deserve to be filled." And so, the woman once dismissed as an extra mouth became the founder of a quiet sanctuary, not with revenge, but with resolve. Not with loud demands, but with soft power, the kind that reshapes lives in silence, one dignified step at a time. It took Angela 2 days to notice her mother was gone. At first, she assumed Margaret had gone for a walk, maybe to her usual cafe. But by the evening of the second day, when the laundry was piling up, the kids were still not picked up from school on time, and the fridge lacked its usual home-cooked meals, worry turned to confusion. And then, panic. "Have you seen Mom?" she asked Derek, who was scrolling through his phone while reheating frozen lasagna. "She's probably upstairs, or at the cafe," he shrugged. Angela bit her lip. "Her room's empty. Her clothes are gone." Derek froze. "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" Angela pulled out her phone, flipping through her messages. No text, no note, nothing. Derek's voice sharpened. "What about the kids tomorrow, and the groceries, and the bills? Didn't she say she was covering this month's electric?" Silence settled like dust on old furniture. They began calling, first casually, then repeatedly. Angela left voice messages. "Mom, where are you? We're worried." Then the tone shifted. "Mom, you can't just disappear. That's not fair." Still, nothing. Angela showed up at the cafe Margaret frequented, but the barista only offered a soft smile. "She hasn't been here since last Thursday, but she seemed happy that day. Said something about new beginnings." At night, Derek paced, rattling off calculations aloud. "Without her pension supplement, we're short. We'll have to dip into savings. Maybe we delay the car upgrade. And who's going to get the kids after school? Angela sat on the couch, her hands trembling around her phone. She opened a message thread with her mother, hundreds of old texts about dinner prep, pickup times, cheerful memes, and gentle reminders. She scrolled through them, searching for a sign, a warning, a hint that Margaret had been planning this. There was none. Just quiet, reliable love. Finally, after 5 days of unanswered calls, Margaret responded. A simple text. I haven't disappeared. I've stepped away from a place where I was no longer respected. Angela read it aloud, her voice cracking. What's that supposed to mean? Derek muttered, though the question hung rhetorically in the air. Angela didn't reply. Deep inside, she already knew. In the absence of Margaret's quiet presence, the household began to collapse in the most ordinary ways. No one to sew the loose buttons, water the wilting plants, remember the dentist appointments, or leave warm soup on the stove when someone felt sick. The children asked about Grandma daily, and Angela lied more than once. She's just on a little break. But it wasn't a break, it was a reckoning. Without the silent scaffolding of Margaret's care, they realized what had been holding the house together wasn't money or convenience aid, was love wrapped in everyday gestures, unglamorous and unacknowledged. And now, that love had chosen to redirect itself towards someone who needed it just as much. Margaret. For the first time in years, she was no longer surviving in someone else's space. She was thriving on her own. Life at the Well House unfolded like a gentle sunrise, quiet, steady, full of warmth that asked for nothing in return. Margaret, at 74, no longer moved to the rhythms of someone else's household. She woke each morning not to chores or silence broken by passive-aggressive remarks, but to her own breath, her own intentions, and the soft hum of possibility. Her new apartment was Modesta sunny corner unit on the 3rd floor, with a small balcony just big enough for her morning tea and a pot of lavender. It wasn't grand, but it was hers. And more than that, it was a part of something bigger. Downstairs, where the lobby once stood cold and impersonal, Margaret had helped create a gathering space. Wicker chairs, warm lamps, and the scent of fresh-baked scones now greeted the women who lived there, many older, many having experienced similar erasure in their own families. Some had fled neglect, others were simply forgotten. But here, they mattered. Margaret spent her afternoons in the rooftop garden, where tomatoes clung to vines and bees danced around marigolds. On Thursday evenings, she hosted story circles, where women gathered with cups of peppermint tea to share slices of their lives. Some cried, some laughed, all felt seen. Word spread. A local women's shelter began referring residents transitioning out of difficult situations. A college student, doing her thesis on intergenerational wisdom, came to interview Margaret and never left, eventually moving into the building and helping with resident programs. The building was thriving, not because of money, but because of meaning. One evening, after a storytelling circle, a younger tenant named Delilah, barely 30, newly divorced, and working 2 jobs slingered behind. She approached Margaret hesitantly. "Do you ever miss them?" she asked. "The ones who took you for granted?" Margaret stirred her tea slowly, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the city lights blinked like distant hopes. "I don't miss how they made me feel," she said softly, "but I do think of them, especially the girl Angela used to be the one who brought me dandelions in a juice glass and cried when I got a paper cut." Delilah nodded, her own eyes misting. "So, do you forgive them?" Margaret smiled, gentle and unwavering. "Forgiveness isn't something I trade like a favor. Love isn't a loan to be repaid. It's a seed. But if it's not watered with respect, it doesn't grow. It just sits there, untouched." Her words floated into the quiet like truth wrapped in silk. Later that night, as she watered her lavender and looked up at the stars, Margaret felt no bitterness, no lingering ache for validation. What she had built, this home, this community, this peace, was rooted not in resentment, but in reclaiming herself. She hadn't burned a bridge. She'd simply built a better one, and walked across it, alone, whole, and finally free. Love without respect is a form of emotional debt quietly accumulating until the heart can no longer afford it. For a long time, Margaret had paid that debt with patience, with silence, with the aching hope that one day they would see her again, not just as a figure in the background, but as the woman who once built classrooms, raised a daughter, and stood steady through life's hardest storms. But when recognition never came, she didn't shout, she didn't demand, she stepped away. Many mistook her silence for surrender. It wasn't. It was observation. It was her way of studying the truth that words often cover up. When people show you who they are, silence lets you watch more closely. At the Well House, Margaret became more than a retired principal. She became a mentor, a quiet pillar for women finding themselves after years of being erased. In the rooftop garden, she taught them to plant things that would outlive the pain. Tomatoes for resilience, lavender for calm, basil for the sweetness that still remained. Every Thursday, in the common room with mismatched chairs and soft lamplight, she hosted story night. Women of different ages gathered, some laughing, some shy, some still healing. And Margaret would say, "Tell it the way it happened, then tell me how you felt." Because facts matter, but feelings shape the future. One evening, after the group had left and she was stacking teacups in the kitchenette, a young woman lingered behind. "Ms. Margaret," she asked softly, "do you ever think about going back? To your daughter?" The question wasn't sharp, only curious. Margaret didn't flinch. "I think about her, yes," she replied. "But going back would mean going back to who I was when I let myself be small. I've outgrown that version of me. Do you forgive her?" Margaret placed the last cup down gently and smiled. "Forgiveness isn't a doorway back into harm. It's a fence I build to protect myself, so I don't bleed twice for the same cut." She paused, then added, "Helping someone should come from love, not guilt. And sometimes, the kindest thing you can say is a soft no." Outside, the city carried on. Inside, Margaret exhaled slow, steady, certain. For the first time in years, her life was her own. Quiet, intentional, and deeply dignified.